heyday of Rome. In that book, it says, it didn't take very long for the news to literally reach around the known world that a baby boy was born, a very special boy. He was heralded as the one who would bring peace to the world. One document that survived more than 2,000 years announced he was the Savior of mankind. And I quote, his birth marked the beginning of all good tidings for the world. Michael Grant wrote in The 12 Caesars. But the problem is they weren't talking about the birth and the birthday of Jesus. They were celebrating the birthday and the reign of Caesar Gaius Augustus Octavius, later named Caesar Augustus, which means supreme or divine ruler. See, Augustus had ascended to the seat of power after his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, was assassinated. And Augustus took over a rather disorganized association of competing regions, and over the next 45 years, he forged it into the Roman Empire that we think about today. He built magnificent buildings and temples and paved roadway systems, built aqueducts, instituted Pax Romana and the Peace of Rome, in other words, administrated financial, legal, and religious reforms. Fact is, the month of August would be named in his honor. You see, several years before the birth of Christ, even Halley's Comet that we know today and we call Halley's Comet blazed across that early morning night sky, and Caesar Augustus proclaimed when he saw it, this was the spirit of his adopted father, Julius Caesar, ascending into the heaven as one of the gods. The citizens eagerly believed him, and Augustus then minted coins with Julius Caesar's likeness on one side, and on the other side his own likeness with the words, Caesar, the Son of God. So what says that we who believe that it's actually Jesus Christ was the Son of God? And I don't think it's any accident that when you look at this narrative that Luke put together, actually Luke chapter 1 and 2 tell the story of Jesus. And he documents about this same Caesar Augustus. You see, when you're looking at this Bethlehem's big event, the overview you can summed up in 3 stages, and we're just going to look at the newborn baby because we're walking into the next 10 days of Christmas season. And I'm glad we can take time to take just a moment and look at a very familiar text. And for many of you grew up, as I did, knowing this story. I can't help from keeping other images like little children like this with dressed up in these same characters. But this is the real deal. You see, Luke documents the newborn baby, then he documents the child, verse 21 to 38, and this is where you pick up the story of other characters involved in this that recognize Mary and Joseph's unique son, a child that was recognized and circumcised and lifted up by even Simeon. I'm assuming Pastor Simeon is probably not named after this one of 4 Simeons in the Bible. It must be Simeon as of Jacob's Simeon. This Simeon, you better pay attention. So I think there's 4, and I think Simeon's name is mentioned 50 times, as I recall, driving down here thinking about it. But I also understand that Luke then documented the child then to his youthful years, and those years that you would know as Luke documents when he was 12 and he shows up at his father's house and people are frantic about where in the world. Can you imagine mom and dad for 3 days trying to figure out your boy? Thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people. You think the mall is bad. And in the midst of all of this, you only find one phrasing that Luke puts in, and the only one he puts in at the end of chapter 2, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. That's the only last reference you see to Jesus until he shows up in the public scene at 30. So we don't have a whole lot of documentation about the early years of Jesus' life. But you do have to understand this event was a big deal. So I would suggest to you these are 4 groupings of people. If you look at this story we just read, let's step back, and these are the 4. Let me mention these 4, and let me fill in a little bit and finish with one simple story as well. But notice that, first of all, his birth brought a family from home. You see it in the first 4 or 7 verses here. And it's seen through everyday logic. I mean, this is the story in which, in the context of this, Caesar had decided to tax the people more, and it was an important event because Rome needed more money. And this is the time that Caesar, the king, who's sleeping warm between the silken sheets in a kingly royal bed, as one author notes, his dreams of greatness and immortality are consuming. Little does he know the greatness and the greatest eternal king had just been born, one who be established and an eternal reign. Fact is, Micah 5:2 says, "But thou Bethlehem, Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me that is be a ruler in Judah." And of course, as I mentioned in this story, the census starts using military and taxation purposes, and Bethlehem here that's mentioned, the place, and those accommodations that you well know the story were primitive. Even the Eastern Inn was the crudest of arrangements. Some of you have had the chance to be in Bethlehem and know they've identified one particular little, they call the manger. It's sometimes hard for us to see and imagine this. Actually, today you can't even get into Bethlehem because it's Palestinian controlled, but most would go up in Jerusalem as we've done, and you look over the fields of Bethlehem. It's beautiful. But this birth did bring this family, Joseph, who needed to be in Bethlehem because it was prophesied, his wife that he was espoused to. You wonder whether Mary, who actually didn't have to go as far as the taxation was concerned, but they were espoused together, and she didn't want to be there by herself, and so they make the journey down, and it's so eloquently stated in King James Version, and she brought forth a firstborn son, but it does mention while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. There's a lot of pain and agony, and for us as men that have had the privilege to watch our children go through childbirth know that for only women that would be willing to go through this for their child. If it was up to the men, we'd have a very small population. But it's stated in this, and it's documented. And this was the family that brought. In fact, as one author notes, from Joseph's view, seeing her pain, the stinking barnyard, their poverty, people's indifference, the humiliation, the sense of utter helplessness, feeling shame at not being able to provide for a young Mary on the night of her travail, all that would make a man either curse or cry. She couldn't have been more than 15 years old. And there's many messages about the innkeeper. And many people sometimes are like that innkeeper. Chambers of their souls are filled with needless things and stuff that doesn't matter. But understand that even as the great commentary Boyce states, it was clearly a leap down, as if the Son of God rose from his splendor and stood poised at the rim of the universe, irradiating light, and dove headlong, speeding through the stars over the Milky Way to Earth's galaxy, finally past Arcturus, where he plunged into this world and now finds himself through the womb of a woman and the huddle of animals. Nothing could be lower. But Mary, it says in verse 19, delighted in the wonder of all of these amazing things. And the reality is, with you understand that seen through this logic of Joseph and Mary and the insights, but the point is, as we look at the family that brought from a home, that we should humbly pray and ponder. And just as these characters did, we as well, I'm afraid at times we lose the wonder of it because we're so familiar. But one grouping was this birth that brought a family from home. Number two, when you look at this text, you realize his birth also summoned shepherds from the field. I mean, who better to know about lambs than the shepherds? for they would appreciate the very Lamb of God that took away the sins of the world, and understand as well that we don't really know that the exact day was December 25th. A lot of reasons why historically that was picked. But certainly historically, understanding that this was the time of year in which there would be a lot of lambs that were being born and shepherds there in those fields. But understand, immediately they began to announce the good news with these angels, telling them and listening about these angels and wonderful birth. And when they left, they continually glorified and praised God for all they experienced. And understand that the shepherds themselves were just lower than lepers. They were the low caste to a high caste to the outcast, as one author said. I like the fact that noting that shepherds were nobodies in Abraham's day, and they were elevated when David, the shepherd boy, was king, and knowing that Bethlehem was the city of David, but he was a shepherd. So Jesus elevating it by calling himself a shepherd, and the chief shepherd now as pastors, a vocation, that's a privilege. And the shepherds were perhaps camped about a mile from the inn, and they certainly took off running and leaping the low Judean fences and entering the enclosure. But don't miss the fact that the place of the shepherds and the angels, all of this, as those shepherds, that we ourselves are just like that outcast into your world that you live in. You will never be fully embraced and accepted when you end up standing up for Christ. But we're human, and we want that acceptation. But I think the point is, as I look at another of this second group, that we really should promptly obey. When I look at the shepherds, they become a great example to help us and understand that when God does speak to us, we need to obey. So understand thirdly as well that it's not just his birth that brought a family from home, or his birth that summoned shepherds from the field, but thirdly, his birth invited angels from heaven. You see it in verse 9, and verse 13, and verse 14. I mean, this one angel, when they lifted their voices to God, it was, as somebody called, cosmic stereo. It was a place in which, for these angels that were a multitude of hosts, Dr. Boyce states that a great company is literally a multitude, not 50, not 150, not 1,500, but beyond count. He says, I think every one of the God's angels was there because this was the most amazing event that had ever happened in the entire universe. I think the heavenly host stretched from horizon to horizon, obscuring the winter constellations. He says, I like to imagine that they radiated golds and pinks and electric blue and hyacinthus and ultraviolet. Maybe some were even sparkling. But this is out in the middle of a place in which for angels that showed up at big events. And the only angels we know of that are named are Gabriel and Michael, who showed up, Daniel 500 years earlier, to prove to Daniel, I've been withheld by forces, but I'm here to assure you. And so it was with Zacharias in chapter 1, so it was with Mary, so it was with Joseph, and now the shepherds. That'd tell you something. I mean, I live with an angel, and she speaks to me every day, but I'm not sure that I've seen one other than my wife. I'm sure you're watching, honey, but I mean, and I think if we had any kind of experience like this, quite honestly, it would change our perspective. I've had the privilege to be in and out of multiple countries, living over in Guam for just south of 20 years, and many times over in China. We're part of a training program with pastors. And many of them, they were atheists, and somehow a Christian got a word to them, and they're all of them would end up saying, you know, God, if you're real, prove it. And I can tell you story after story of hair-raising experiences where these guys, They had angels, like things happened. Supernatural things happened. And that was the spark that got them interested in order to look at the Scriptures. And the Scriptures is what helped them turn to Christ. Many of them are pastors. Amazing. In fact, sometimes it does happen, and we don't even know it. And I like to hear stories like this. But it's all ancillary to the point. I mean, one particular missionary as illustration. I mean, it's fun to hear stories of angels. This missionary was back at the States raising support, and he was moving from one church to another church, and he ended up on a Saturday being at a church, and he basically almost had to drive through the night to get to a church like this one. And he said, God, please just keep me awake. I'm exhausted, but I said I would be there on Sunday morning. And so he takes off driving. It's torrential rain, and he decides, man, I got a coffee, and there's a hitchhiker. And he doesn't stop like you would stop, but he stopped, picked this guy up, and they get engaged in conversation. They end up talking, and next thing you know, a long night, he's wide awake. He shows up. They said, well, let's stop and get coffee. Stops in the cafe, has coffee with the guy, ends up going. The stranger goes his way, gets in the car, and he's paused. He goes, you know what? I never got that guy's name. And then he's back in there. So he goes back in, and he says to the lady, hey, do you know that other guy was with? She looks at him and says, what other guy are you talking about? I thought it was a little strange that you had 2 cups of coffee and you were talking to yourself. I don't know who you're talking about. He said, I get back in the car and I realized this guy was never wet. It was pouring down rain when he was on a... I love to hear stories like that. It's like, that's so cool. I've never had one, but man, that sounds cool by this missionary. But I'm going to tell you something. That's not the point of the story. You would have your life changed. I would think I'd have my life changed. Like, bring on the angels. But the reality is that his birth invited angels from heaven to point to who? Jesus. He's the Son of God, not Caesar Augustus. And he wants to show up and be that in your life, in my life. Because you have most of Burlington, the 23,000, that is 4,000 less than you had at census in 2020. Your city is getting smaller, and most of them aren't here today. And they're not going to come in and hear an amazing message by Pastor Simeon. You know who's the message? You're the message. And I know that's what Pastor Simeon encourages you. And you take courage and take opportunities. You don't need to lead every one of them to the Lord immediately. I've got to get home because we committed to going to supper with a neighbor that invited us. Been in the neighborhood 7 years. First time this has happened. First time we showed up at 414 Northeast 28th Street. We were there 3 months, and no neighbor said anything to us. It was October. At Christmas time, my wife bought Christmas cakes for our neighbors and put a tract in there and gave it to the 4 closest to us. And immediately, all of them showed up within the next week, like guilty. And we're like, you don't need to feel guilty. This is what we do. And for 7 years, we've done that. And now there's 10 of them. I told my wife, I said, I can't afford this. Come on. Every one of them know. I've witnessed a few of them. I've invited a few of them to church. None have come. But I'm just the distributor. I'm not the manufacturer. And for these angels, they delivered a message, which leads us to lastly understand that birth not just invited the angels from heaven. The point was we should also continually praise. But Bethlehem's big event in this first 20 verses also tells us that his birth, may I say it this way, called the world from their sin. Because as Mary's pondering this, and the angels now are gone, the shepherds have come and worshiped. And everyone around, these shepherds are telling people, and they heard it and they wondered at these things which were told them by the shepherds. And they were praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen and told unto them. And this is what our responsibility is sit and turn and tell others and understand that how we all would like to have been there, to be a fly in the ear, as one person said, of one of the shepherd's sheep. But actually, though the choir in heaven played a major role, we on earth have the best part because we're all the ones who receive God's grace. And we all want to be in a place of pleasing to the Lord, and this is why the story of salvation starts with the cradle. And through that crib, eventually shows up with this same Jesus, a man that lived a purpose life and a purposeful death and a purpose resurrection, and brought in the place that this was the gift of salvation, the unspeakable gift. And know and understand that the truth is, even if Christ were born in Bethlehem 1,000 times, but not within you, you would be eternally lost. And this is where we all want to be able to please the Lord. He is the deity. He's not just another counterfeit story of a virgin birth by some religion. It's a relationship. And this time of year, God desires to draw all men to himself. And there are days in which you wonder about it. But the conclusion is that with this time of year, God does desire, and he wants to do it through you. You know, there's a few other babies that have been born at Christmas time. I looked it up, and I found anywhere from only 14,000 to about 70,000 that have been born on Christmas Day. Less than 14,000, because they're born on Christmas Day, have got the name Christmas. It caught my attention that in 1766, 10 years before the United States, there was a young man born in West Wales on Christmas Day. Baby Evans was naturally then named Christmas, which was often done in that day and in that country. At the age of 9, his father died, leaving the family in complete poverty. He had no formal education. He was converted at the age of 18 in a pretty dramatic way, actually. And after this conversion, his friends didn't like it. Some documents say that Evans was 7 foot. I haven't been able to document it. If it was, I don't know why you'd have a bunch of his friends that turned thugs and beat him up. One of them took a big sharp stick and poked him and eventually poked one of his eyes out. I don't know that he was 7 foot, but I do know that he eventually became known as the one-eyed preacher of Wales. It's interesting that another Christmas earned much later that he was known as the Bunyan of Wales for his colorful and dramatic delivery of the gospel message, which he always preached in the Welsh language. And one great preacher called him the Prince of Preachers of his day. But I would suggest to you at this Christmas season, may we none of us forget the Prince of Peace and the true documentation of his young life that was miraculous. We do know that Joseph, somewhere along the line, passed on. We do know that his mother was foretold that there would be a deep pain and sorrow in her heart. It came true to watch her son on the cross. But don't miss the faith you need to put in Jesus Christ for the familiar story, and be faithful to it. I'm thankful that as a child I made a profession of faith. I'm thankful also at 20 that God really spoke to my heart, and I walked out of a service and sat down on a picnic bench in Buchanan, Michigan in 1976 and said, God, whatever you want to do with my life, it doesn't matter anymore. And I'm glad I made that commitment. And I pray that be the case for you today. God, thank you for the truth of your simple story, the Bethlehem's big event. And we do know that there is this season. And thank you for helping us understand there is a reason. And even though that other world religions would give to us stories that are fictitious. We know them not to be true, as a counterfeit, that this story is true. It's not made up. And it's changed so many of our lives. Thank you for this church and the faithfulness to it. And when you take us through deep waters, they don't mean to drown us. You want to cleanse us and used even in greater ways. And thank you for this church and their love for their pastor and their family, and continue to bless them and use them. And many of us that do have lost family members, that we would be faithful in giving this gospel out, that you drew a world to this story, and ask it in Jesus' name.